Hare Krishna. Okay, I couldn't get on for a moment. Couldn't get online for a moment. I was getting worried there. So we're now online. Hopefully it's going to work well. And we are on our 8th class about women and men, the roles of men and women, especially the roles in Krishna consciousness. And we've been reading from an article by Vishaka in the last few lessons. Of course, yesterday we didn't read. The discussion was sidetracked in a good way. And I've been doing some preparation for these courses, studying a little bit about traditional cultures, both in Krishna consciousness and outside of Krishna consciousness. And then I came across something I wanted to share with you today, which was very interesting, I think, as a historical, sociological discussion on this topic. So, I was interested in the practice of wife beating or punishing women with violence, physical violence. And yesterday I read a story in which a man, a devotee man, was beating his wife. I don't know the details, slapping or beating hard or whatever. But it was concerning to the woman, and the woman brought it to the temple president. And the temple president brought it to Prabhupada because Prabhupada was there at the time. And so she wanted to ask, she wanted to find out what Prabhupada had to say. And this is quoted from a devotee named Sudama, who's no longer alive, that he said that Prabhupada told him any man who beats his wife is a dog and the wife should leave him. That's the only time I know in which Prabhupada commented on a specific situation. So you could take it with a grain of salt or you could take it as it is. This is as the story has been presented to us. Any man who beats his wife is a dog and the wife should leave him, according to Srila Prabhupada. So then I became interested, and Katie would know, because Katie is Muslim. I became interested in the practices of wife beating and other traditions, Christianity, Islam, and so forth. Obviously, I'm not an expert. But it is allowed in Islam, but it's interesting. Just what I found so interesting is that Islam says that the husband should admonish the wife if she doesn't listen to him. And if admonishment doesn't work, admonishment means some form of chastisement, I would suppose, or correction at least, nicely correct or perhaps chastise. You've done something wrong. I'm right, you're wrong type of thing. This is wrong, you shouldn't do it. If she doesn't listen, then he should not sleep with her as a punishment. There's a punishment to her or to show his disapproval, and then if that doesn't work, he can lightly beat her. So one Muslim scholar had said, well, in the context of that culture, men were beating their wives with canes and sticks and so on. So the injunction by Muhammad was actually to lighten it, to just beat her with like a toothbrush and not in a way that would hurt her. So he made the point that it's just like Prabhupada said, that Muhammad said, don't have sex with relatives, your mother, your sister, and so on, which must have meant that was going on, at least in some sections of that society. Otherwise, why would that have to be presented? So he said, in the same way, this wife beating was going on in that culture, and so Muhammad's instruction was actually to lessen it, to just like minimize it, that you're already doing it. So that this was discussed with some Muslim clerics, scholars, not scholars, clerics, imams. And of course, conservative imams follow the Quran literally. So they said, well, this is what we preach because this is what it says in the Quran. That it says that you can do this, but do it lightly. Don't do it in a way that bruises her or brings blood, but you can do that. So it's a very traditional way of dealing with a wife within a traditional culture where men were basically regarded as always right, and the wife, and they would determine if the wife was right or wrong. That's kind of obvious. That's where it's coming from. So I was thinking of that, and I was thinking, well, this is interesting, because that's a very traditional male-female role in marriage, at least religiously. So Madhuri Radhika says, yes, beating wife is very common in Islam. I watched a documentary a few years back. They even quoted from the Quran that they're free to beat, beating should be gentle like children in the name of, yeah, even Christians believe in punishing your children with a little slap here or there. Yeah. It was actually, so this imam's point was it was meant to reduce violence, because they were already doing this. It was part of their culture. So we can see that traditional cultures, many of them were male-dominated, and male-dominated culture was interpreted to mean what the man says is right, and the woman has to listen. So I was thinking of that. We can understand where that's coming from. And if the man were much more elevated and more well-trained than the woman, then we could understand that. If, let's say, a woman is not educated and a man is highly educated, that in many areas of life he would probably know better. I don't think he knows better necessarily about raising children and domestic things. And perhaps the man would let his wife make those decisions. I can't say, but you have this general idea that the man is superior, he knows better, the wife should listen, he should control. Right, okay. So that you'll find in traditional cultures and religious cultures. It's quite common in general, although probably not 100%. But so I was thinking, okay, if you go to Manu Samhita, you will find similar things. We may complain about Sharia law, but if you go to Manu Samhita, you'll find similar things. So, but of course, it's not that Prabhupada came to establish the Manu Samhita. He came to establish principles of bhakti. Now we have some devotees in our movement who are very concerned about women having the same rights as men, or the same rights in certain ways, even the same rights for service. And we have devotees who are very concerned that there are devotees who are concerned that women have equal rights. In other words, the liberal conservative, so to speak. And so when I was listening to these imams explain the Quran and explain how it's in the Quran, therefore we have to follow it, we can't interpret it. It's what is said, so we must follow it, and we must understand it, and therefore it's okay for a husband to admonish his wife, to punish her by not sleeping with her, and to punish her with some form of mild corporal punishment. Now, this is very interesting, because the research that I recently studied tells us, at least in Western society, that if you do this, you will likely end up in a very bad marriage or divorced. And that when there's a problem, you should try to understand your wife's point of view. Why is she saying this? What's behind it? Are there hopes and dreams behind it, or are there experiences behind it that are making her respond in this way? Maybe traumatic experiences in her life. Is it part of her culture, part of her values that she's responding this way? In other words, you're meant to try to understand her perspective, why she's acting in that way, and then perhaps at that point you can better discuss it, or perhaps support it, or at least accept it. If you can't fully support it, at least accept it, knowing why she feels this way or why she acts this way. That's the general research has shown, that if you do that, your marriage is much more likely to last and be a good marriage than if you admonish and you become contemptuous, which means you put yourself in a superior position, which these traditional cultures have tended to do. I don't think every man does that, but that's the general idea of the culture, that the male is superior. So in some way he may make the wife feel inferior, and we have seen that in our movement as well, and it's just part of the culture. So the research that has been done for the last 40 years on marriage by studying married couples tells us that one of the ways that you can determine whether a marriage will be successful or not, one of them, is if the man is contemptuous, or even the wife, but in this case we're talking about the man. So if the man is contemptuous, that means if he takes a superior position, he makes the wife feel less capable, less intelligent, etc. And therefore puts her down for doing, quote unquote, the wrong thing, or saying saying the wrong things. The research tells us that you can predict if one of the partners does that, the marriage won't last. If it does last, it will be what we call friends, not even friends, people living together but not actually sharing their lives, not a compatible, happy marriage. So you can stay together, you can be divorced but stay together, or you can be divorced and be divorced. It amounts to the same thing. You're divorced internally, but you're staying together for the kids or for other reasons. So that's the research. So I was thinking, isn't that interesting? What Muhammad is saying to do in the Quran may have worked within that culture, may have been a step up in that culture. Admonish your wife is a lot better than beat her up or scream at her or send her out of the house, which may have been the culture. We don't know, but let's assume something more drastic was generally being done. So what Muhammad was saying is, do this. It's lesser. It's a lesser of the evils. And we'll look at it and think, oh, this is very bad. But the point that I'm making, or 2 points I'm making, is that based on the Western mentality, and Islam was not being applied to America in 2019. It was being applied to a different group of people in a different culture. And so what's being done today by many is those same principles are being applied, even against evidence that it doesn't work, unless, of course, you had a very devout family who 100% believed. I would say it doesn't even work that way. We have a different mentality today. And so I was thinking and appreciating how Prabhupada totally understood this when he came to the West. He very much adapted to our mentality, and he didn't enforce things upon us that didn't fit within the way we were raised and think. Of course, you could say he did in some ways because we had regulative principles, but I'm talking about social norms which he could see would be difficult or impossible for us to follow, or which may have actually interfered with our Krishna consciousness. So Prabhupada's goal was focused on getting us to be Krishna conscious. He wasn't focused on getting us to follow certain cultural or social standards, unless he saw, number one, we could follow, number two, it was necessary for us to follow, number three, it was necessary because it would be necessary for our Krishna consciousness. So if it was something that would be nice to follow or good to follow, but difficult for us, or we as husband and wife didn't want to follow, it wasn't that Prabhupada would say, no, you must do this. As we've read, I don't know if we've read this, but as I've said before, that one woman had brought her husband into Krishna consciousness, and it was an awkward situation because now she was a bit in a superior role, and Prabhupada said, well, if you're more Krishna conscious than he is, then he can follow you. So Prabhupada had no problem in switching the roles, whereas, at least for fundamentalists, they wouldn't do that. And it's interesting. It was not a critique. It'll sound like a critique, and maybe it is. But it's interesting that there's a element in our movement which would also not, I think, agree to some of the things that Prabhupada did, and the way they disagree, which you can't disagree with Prabhupada, is by saying those were temporary measures. He didn't really mean for them to continue, which is a judgment I think most of us would be very concerned about making. Or that the other argument, that Prabhupada made decisions because he was pressured to make them, pressured by women who wanted a certain position, so he gave in to them, but he really didn't want to make them. So those are the arguments. But from my personal perspective, that is not what I saw. But I saw Prabhupada making adjustments so that we would be happy in Krishna consciousness, we would be satisfied in Krishna consciousness. And that understanding that we as Americans, as I'm talking about America now in the early days of the movement, we as Americans, what was quote unquote normal for us, what was comfortable for us to adapt to, and what was not comfortable. The Prabhupada wanted us to be happy in Krishna consciousness, and from what I saw, didn't expect us to do things just because they were traditionally done, if it had no redeeming value for our being Krishna conscious, and it was difficult or impossible for us to follow it. So I was just appreciating Prabhupada's, I don't know if I would call it intelligence. I mean, you could call it intelligence, obviously that's part of it, but just maybe it's more his sensitivity, or as being, maybe we could say Prabhupada being realistic, because we've heard stories that when Prabhupada went back to India and brought his disciples, that some or many of his godbrothers did not even accept his disciples as devotees, because we were not born in Brahmin families, we were not even born within Varnashram, so we were considered Malachas and Yavanas, and they considered that we couldn't actually be pure Vaishnavas. So we could imagine that those people would not have been able to do what Prabhupada did if they came to the West. Who would they preach to? How would they make us devotees if we're all Malachas and Yavanas? And when Prabhupada was in his last days, he was, we felt, the devotees felt that we'd maybe caused trouble for Prabhupada because we were so neophyte and fighting a lot and the leaders falling down. And Prabhupada said, no, you are the best association. I like your association. So Prabhupada was able to look beyond our Malecha culture and our Malecha nature, although he would often point out our Malecha nature, being unclean and so forth. But he honed in on the bhakti, the sincerity, the devotion, the service, the faith we had. And he appreciated that. And if he didn't, he would have given up on us, obviously. So when Prabhupada looked at Shastra, he looked at it in terms of application. As Prabhupada said, kala, time, desha, place, and patra. Kala, desha, patra, circumstance. That was a big thing for Prabhupada. And you'd see in more fundamental religious views, it's not viewed in terms of place, time, and circumstance. It's viewed in terms of principle. This is the principle, and this principle is for all place, time, and circumstances. Now, I'm not saying that some principles aren't for all time, place, and circumstance. But I'm saying some are not, because some would be counterproductive. Some would be impossible for us to follow. Some wouldn't make sense. Some would degrade us, as in the example I gave. If Prabhupada said, the man is always right, if the wife does not do everything he says, he should admonish her. If not, he should not satisfy her. If still she doesn't follow him, he should beat her. Wouldn't you think that's strange? And then Prabhupada quoted Manu Samhita. Wouldn't you think that's strange? Would you have joined Krishna consciousness? Would you have left if you found out Would that have created doubts in the validity of Krishna consciousness, or perhaps even doubts in Prabhupada's authority? Probably, for many it would have. So I was just appreciating how that's not who Prabhupada was at all. Prabhupada was breaking many rules. And why was he breaking rules? Because he ultimately didn't see that he was breaking rules. He saw that what he was doing was furthering the Krishna consciousness movement. And so anything that would further the Krishna conscious movement, that wouldn't compromise our own bhakti, he would do it. And so you could say he was compromising or breaking rules per se. He was breaking some traditional rules, but in the higher sense, you could say he was adhering more closely to the spirit of the rule than if he just followed the rule. So, that's my introduction. I thought that was interesting how in conservative views of religion, literal interpretation, okay, literal interpretation, if it's meant to be interpreted that way, that's one thing. But without application to time, place, and circumstance, you breed a religion that can become irrelevant and can become the festering place of people with fanatic mentalities that can produce unsavory behavior in some cases. So, in a sense, I thought it was healthy that these Muslims were saying, this is in the Quran, you have to follow it. But they didn't have the time, place, circumstance application of it. So it came across to me as fanatical, and it came across to me as almost like a denial of reality. You're saying this is what should be done, but this doesn't work. If you do this, it doesn't work in this modern context. This is not, people are different. Like we often say, well, Jesus spoke in a certain context, Krishna spoke in a certain context, Muhammad spoke in a certain context, and so you have to understand the context they spoke in. And so you can understand the essence rather than get caught in the details. But it doesn't seem like traditionalists are so interested in context as they are interested in the letter of the law. So that was my realization for this morning in my preparation. Before each class, I like to study something that might be of interest and relevance, and then look at it in the light of Krishna consciousness. So we're going to now go back and read What's a Woman to Do. If you want to follow this article, it's entitled What's a Woman to Do. You can just Google that. And it's written by Vishaka Devi Dasi, who is co-producer with her husband Yadabar of the film on Prabhupada, the movement, the mantra, and the guru who started it all. So we are I believe, if you're following this, I'll actually share where we left off. I think is this section called Classifications on page 12. Actually, let me go back, because I'm not sure. By going back, so we were reading about, the last thing we read was interesting. Well, Prabhupada said every woman should be married. He said everyone should be married, every woman should be married. And then Prabhupada was asked, well, what about women who don't want to be married? And Prabhupada said, then, like in a convent, they can live single, they don't have to get married. He said, actually, why bother getting married? Make Krishna your husband. That's all you need. So there was a statement that Prabhupada wrote in his books Is there a support group? I don't know, for women. You might contact the Vaishnavi ministry and find out. So Prabhupada made this statement that all women should be married, everyone should be married, and then when asked about it, he said, well, it doesn't have to be. So that's an example of Prabhupada adjusting, saying, oh, we have women who don't want to be married, okay, there's no problem. If they can live a life similar to the life of a nun, single, that's fine. So Prabhupada was extremely adaptable, which is why Prabhupada was successful. And so, having that history behind us, I find it curious that some devotees are not willing to be as flexible as Srila Prabhupada. And what we're facing, obviously, is a world that's drastically changing. In my estimation, it's changing more drastically and more quickly than ever before in history. Of course, I'm not a historian. I can only speak of the 69 years I've been alive. And the last 10 or 20 years, I have seen more changes than I've seen in my whole life. And I would predict the next 20, it is predicted the next 20 years, we will see way more changes than we've seen, or even in the next 10 years, way more changes than we've seen in the last 50. So now we're looking at that situation. Does this mean the roles of men and women are changing in society? Of course, they're changing. There's more women in the workforce now than men. That's women's position is much more equal in the eyes of society, in the eyes of men and women, women and men, than ever before. There are more and more men who are staying home taking care of kids because their wives can earn more money. So roles are changing, right? So now if you have these traditional roles, it may not always apply, as these roles are no longer traditional, and not to be aware of that and to adjust to that, it's not intelligent. It makes us less relevant. So that's how Prabhupada stayed relevant. As we said yesterday, he maintained his principles, but he was able to adapt without watering down the principles, but to adapt to make it relevant. You know, I told that funny story that you may have heard of, this young man in his late 20s who was coming to the Berkeley Temple a few months before I moved in, and I was also coming regularly. And so I knew him, and he used to come, it wasn't shaved up, but he used to wear a saffron dhoti when he would come to the temple. And I'm not sure if he was working what he was doing, but he spent a lot of time at the temple. And then one day he shocked us and he showed up in a sari. And we're a young movement, young devotees, and this had never happened before. It's not obviously a common event, but how do you deal with this? You know, a man is showing up as a woman and acting like a woman, and well, does he go to the brahmacharini ashram and hang out there? Does he use the women's bathroom? Is it okay if he hangs out with the men, or how do we deal with him? It was confusing. So they wrote to Prabhupada, and I believe it just shows the adaptability of Prabhupada, perhaps more than anything. And Prabhupada wrote this young man and said, decide whether you want to be a man or you want to be a woman. Because what he was doing was, a few days later he would come back, and then he would come back in a dhoti, then come back in a sari. So it was very confusing for us. I mean, it was already confusing, but maybe if he just stayed in a sari, it would have been easier to deal with, but then he would come back in a dhoti. He wasn't sure what he was. You know, I guess he was testing the waters. And transgenders were not really that common in those days. At least I wasn't aware of it. They weren't coming out of the closet so much. So Prabhupada wrote him and just said, decide what you are, and, you know, practice Krishna consciousness. So, you know, obviously a very traditional role would be, you're a man, be a man. And Prabhupada was willing to concede to allow a man to be a woman. I mean, think about that. That was 1969. This was not a popular view, even amongst liberals, I don't think. All the liberals were at least mainstream society was not certainly ready for this. And you would think or see of Prabhupada as a conservative Hindu, and in this sense he's as liberal as you can get in accepting this man. Whatever will help you in your Krishna consciousness, then do that. Isn't that interesting? Don't you think? I find that extremely interesting, personally. That Prabhupada was willing to concede. So then, I don't want us to speculate on other things he would concede, but we do have history of things he conceded on, because he didn't feel that conceding would in any way be an impediment for that person's Krishna consciousness, but it would be helpful. So if conceding on a principle would be helpful for someone's spiritual life, Prabhupada would concede on it. And so I find it interesting that even though that we have that example, we have devotees in our movement, some who are very conservative and don't follow that example, and try to write off Prabhupada's example, which I think is extremely dangerous and incorrect. And if Shastra says something, but Prabhupada adjusted it according to time and place, we can't second guess why Prabhupada adjusted it. We know why he adjusted it. He adjusted it to fit within the time, place, and circumstance, because he told us that's why adjustments are made. So to think an adjustment is made because Prabhupada was being pressured to make it by the women, or we couldn't follow anything else, so he was temporarily conceding with us. That's not what he ever said. That's not why he said he was doing it. So to maintain a more conservative approach to Krishna consciousness and spreading Krishna consciousness than Prabhupada maintained is dangerous. Now, historical fact that it's often seen that after a charismatic leader, religious leader, leaves the world, the followers become more fanatical than the leader. So this is something at least to be aware of, that tendency is there. I'm not saying that you have the tendency, but you might have that tendency, and you might not have it, and you might see others have that tendency. It's something to be aware of. That in establishing the principles laid down by Srila Prabhupada, there may be a tendency amongst some of us to become more strict, more fanatical, more stern than Prabhupada, less adaptable than Srila Prabhupada. And that would be a great travesty to Srila Prabhupada's teachings and to his movement, because Prabhupada was the personification of adaptability. I'll give you another example of adaptability. And I'm not saying that these are things we should necessarily do, but they're examples of adaptability. There were some Hindu girls coming and joining Krishna consciousness in Nairobi. Nairobi is in Africa, but many, many Indians live there. And there were no husbands, and Prabhupada said they could marry life members. So, you might think today, well, that sounds reasonable, or that is seems to be a good option. But in those days, no one would ever think like that. That was considered quite a liberal option, that, our brahmacharinis living in the temple could find a husband amongst congregational Indians. So Prabhupada suggested that. He saw, well, there were no husbands in the temple. There weren't qualified brahmacharis. Or maybe the only brahmacharis were Africans, and culturally it wouldn't be acceptable at that time in Nairobi. And so Prabhupada gave that option. Why? Because women need to be married. And so that was an option. So is it bending the rules? I don't say it's bending the rules. I say it's adaptation, according to what would be helpful to those devotees in that situation. So there's so many examples of Prabhupada adapting, letting us wear Western dress to distribute books, And that story, probably maybe the greatest adaptation, was when Prabhupada said, if there's nothing to eat in Eastern Europe, go there to preach and eat meat. Wow. Fortunately, the devotees didn't have to do that, but that's an incredible adaptation. It's like if in order to save people and bring them to Krishna, you have to break one of the regulative principles, it's a higher principle to save them, and Krishna will understand. And so Prabhupada authorized them, if necessary, to do that. That's amazing. He authorized breaking one of the regulative principles. Isn't that amazing? And we have some examples of this, of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta cultivating important people and getting them to come and visit Mayapur. And he had to offer them meat, obviously not cow. So some adaptations were made. Now you might say, but how much can we make? How much can we adapt? Because we may end up watering it down, which is true. We might. We have to be careful. This isn't a license to adapt. I'm just discussing the principle of how in certain religious traditions there's no time, place, circumstance adaptation. And so they end up having a religion that is not so relatable to the modern world, and that causes schisms in the religion because the more liberal or modern people see that the tradition had its time, place, and circumstance 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. It's not applicable. The context is different. It's not working now, and it's producing bad results socially. It's disrupting marriages, and it's in many ways creating chaos. And of course, the conservatives think the liberal is creating chaos. And so, as we said, I think it was yesterday or last week, Prabhupada was liberal and conservative. He knew how to balance both. And I think that's the fear, that if I'm conservative, I give up my liberality. If I'm liberal, I give up my conservativeness. But Prabhupada knew how to balance both, how to maintain principles that were essential without maintaining principles that would degrade the essence of what Krishna consciousness is about. So, our philosophy is, what's the point of a principle if it degrades your Krishna consciousness? If it doesn't help you become Krishna conscious, what's the point of it? There is no point. Just to follow some moral code because, quote unquote, it's Vedic, if it's not helpful for your Krishna consciousness? No. That's not Prabhupada's mood. So, that soliloquy, that monologue, was coming out of the point I just made, that Prabhupada allowed women to remain single, although in his books he said they should all be married. So now, I think we may have read this, but I want to read it again because this is the real, one of the most controversial statements. I could say, in a sense, it's not controversial. It's only controversial if you don't understand it. But most of us don't understand it well, so it is controversial. This is in the Bhagavatam. It's in Prabhupada's books. Generally, all women desire material enjoyment. They are called less intelligent because they are mostly prone to material enjoyment. Srimad Bhagavatam 3:23-54. When I read this in the last class, I changed the word women to men. So someone may think, well, you're changing Prabhupada's books here and you shouldn't do it. But let me just do it and see if this makes sense to you. Generally, I'll say people. Generally, all people desire material enjoyment. They're called less intelligent because they're mostly prone to material enjoyment. Is that true? I would think that's true. Yeah, that's our definition of less intelligent, that you're prone to material enjoyment. So to say women desire material enjoyment means they generally desire it more than men. And I agree with that. At least that's what I see. But do devotee women desire material enjoyment more than non-devotee men as a class? No one has done research. My guess would be no. Non-devotee men desire material enjoyment more than devotee women. If you object, raise your hand. Say something if you object with that statement. If you agree with that statement, send me a heart or a smile or something. And if you don't agree with that statement, send me a frown or send me I don't know what, a fist? How do you disagree on Facebook? Are there emojis you can use to disagree? Like you don't agree with that statement. But now, what's the authority for this, aside from our personal perception? The authority is that Prabhupada said, when you become a devotee, you become most intelligent. And if you still think you're a woman, then you're less intelligent. So, but let's read on. Let's see what Vishaka Devidasi has to say. Again, this is a generalization, not a universal statement. That is, inferred from specific cases and not to be applied indiscriminately. Yes, so, frown. Brajananda is frowning, okay. Radhapriya is frowning. Now, what Vishaka is saying is that obviously there are many, many generalizations made to understand points of philosophy. And that intelligent people understand when a generalization is made, it doesn't apply to every individual, but it's generally like this way. All right, so you go to the mall. What's the proof that women desire material enjoyment more than men? Well, go to the mall and count the number of stores that cater to women, and count the number of stores or departments in department stores that cater to men. Probably it'll be 8-to-1. I'm always this 8-to-1 because Chanakya Pandit says women are 8 times more lusty, which he means not sexually lusty, but they desire material enjoyment 8 times more than men. So they like material things much more than men. They need or want material things much more than men. You know, I would be happy with 1 plate, 1 cup, and 1 spoon. Personally, I'd be happy with 3 shirts and 3 dhotis. That's the male. The male doesn't need as much in general. Are there men that would be happy with 1 plate and 3 shirts? Definitely yes and definitely no. Are there women that would be happy with 1 plate, cup and spoon, and 3 saris and 3 cholis? Some would be. So it's a generalization. But if you go to the mall, you'll see that's mostly stores that cater to women more than men. That's what I notice. Clothes and jewelry stores for women seem to outnumber stores that cater to both sexes. So that's a general observation. Women, we have learned that young girls are thinking about marriage at an early age. They're thinking about home. Yeah, they need more comforts and so on. The men can do austerity in ways women can't, which my wife reminds me periodically when we travel. Or, you know, I'm tired. Okay, I'll just sleep in this chair. You know, that's me. You know, I'll throw a chadar on the floor. I'll sleep there. You know, well, I can't. My wife, well, I can't do that. You know, I need a proper place. I'm not a man. You know, or we have to go here and do this and that. No, I can't do this and that. I'm not a man. So men tend to be, by nature, a little more austere, a little less concerned about material enjoyment. So it's a generalization. And so therefore, when we say women are less intelligent, that's an aspect of what it means, that they're more prone to material enjoyment. Now, if you're prone to material enjoyment, you are prone to be materially degraded. Women protected. Who should they be protected by? By men who are not prone to material enjoyment. So that's one aspect. Of course, they should be protected physically by men who are stronger than they are. And there are women, guys, there are women out there who could who could beat you up. They are stronger than you. They are tougher than you. So, but generally, men are stronger physically. Not always, but generally. And so there's physical protection, and there in women who are prone to material enjoyment, who could degrade themselves, need protection from men. But you see that the irony or the paradox is there are many men who are extremely degraded, who are being saved by their wives, who are not degraded. Alcoholic men, sex monk, womanizers, this and that. They're lazy, they don't want to work. So what I personally find, I don't have statistical research, this is just my observation, and you can agree or disagree, if this is also your observation, that when you read, Carla's husband protects her from spending too much money. I try to protect my wife from spending too much money, but sometimes I can also compete with her. Like this microphone. This is very expensive. So we men, we also desire nice things, but they tend to be more like electronic computers and, cameras and, things like that. So, we have our own set of problems and faults. And sometimes you find that women uplift men. So I find in Kali Yuga, these generalizations, you'll find so many exceptions to them. I understand the generalization, and I can see it, but at the same time, I think we have to be very careful when we make these generalizations, especially in the circle of devotees, and especially when speaking to non-devotees, because non-devotees will not see the world this way, because they'll see the world more based on their experience. And we tend to see the world often on the basis of Shastra, and sometimes we don't understand the Shastra, we don't understand it clearly, or things have changed so much that Kali Yuga has become so, what's the word? Meshed in variety, that you don't have typical roles of male and female. Society has allowed women to be like men, and they're allowing men to be like women. And so these very strict gender roles, and men are like this, women are like that, you don't see it as much as you might have seen it 100 years ago. So when we make generalizations, we have to be careful, and because they're not always applicable. Yes. So this is one example. Less intelligent means more prone to material enjoyment. And I think, most women agree that they tend to be more prone to material enjoyment. But, as I said, there are many women who are more renounced than their husbands. That is a fact. So we can never generalize or stereotype, right? And maybe my wife is more prone to enjoyment than I am, but maybe she's more renounced than most men, at least more renounced than most non-devotee men. And one of the things that we have to be aware of, when we look at a devotee and we say, oh, this devotee woman, why is she so attached to material enjoyment? By the standards of non-devotee women, she's not. But by the standards of men and their renunciation, he may see it. Oh, you're so enjoying, you're so attached, you're buying things that you don't need. But non-devotee women, every week or two, buy things they don't need. Most devotee women buy things they really don't need once in a while. New pair of earrings, new pair of shoes. It's not a common thing, but non-devotees will do that with every paycheck. So I think you have to keep that into consideration also. And the other thing is, this is also interesting. So Shastra says women are less intelligent. So now you get married. Like we have some men who are thinking of getting married or wanting to get married. They're not married yet. And so they've heard women are less intelligent. And so they're thinking, well, I'm going to marry a woman who's less intelligent than I am, which means that I have the right as Muhammad said, to admonish her when she does or says something wrong. And she really needs just to listen to me because I'm always right and she's always wrong, because right here it says she's less intelligent. All right. Is that what you said? Okay. Men, I would ask you, would you lay your life on that statement that you're always right and your wife's always wrong? I don't think any man in his right mind would. But when we're not thinking, then we read these statements and think, well, my wife's just supposed to do whatever I say because Shastra says she's less intelligent. Yeah, okay. So less intelligent is in comparison to intelligent. Less intelligent than who? All men? No. Less intelligent than you? Okay. In what ways are you more intelligent? But in what ways is she more intelligent? These are just common sense questions. But what we find in religious organizations, and we have to be careful, because it's Shastra, there's a tendency to look at Shastra in practical ways, just as, oh, well, this is what it says, and kind of like look at it with blinders, and not actually look and analyze what you're seeing in front of you. So, women are less intelligent because they're prone to material enjoyment. Is this woman you're marrying, if this woman you're marrying so prone to material enjoyment, why did she become a devotee? This is not the place for people prone to material enjoyment. This is the place for people who are trying to renounce material enjoyment. So just to assume that you're more intelligent than your wife or the woman you would marry, that is, I'll let you, men, I'll let you pick the word. You can pick the word. Okay, but will your wife want nicer things than you? Yes. Will she want more clothes than you? Probably. Will she want a bigger house than you? Probably. Okay, so that's there. Does that make her less of a devotee? There will be many men in our movement, even renunciates, and this is not meant to be a criticism, it's meant to be a description of reality, who will need material facility more than your wife. Are they less intelligent? Of course not. It's what they need. By their nature and by their service, they need a certain standard. So, does anyone call them less intelligent because they need certain material facility? No, because we know they're renounced. They're dedicated 24/7 to Krishna consciousness. So why would a woman who's even needing less facility be called less intelligent if she's also fully dedicated? So you see, I think we get corrupted when we blindly look at these statements and we don't understand what they mean. And both men and women need to understand, because if the women don't understand, then they lose self-esteem. What Shastra is saying is, ladies, this is your nature. You like things. For every one kurta your husband has, you have 8 cholis. For every one dhoti your husband has, you have 8 saris. That's your nature. Yeah, you see her through the long. If we're seeing things through a convoluted lens, then everything's convoluted. Even though if you look at it outside the lens, it's not. That's the problem. So, ladies, you like things. It's your nature. You already know that. It's not a self-esteem issue. You know. You like nice clothes, nice jewelry. It's just your nature. You like to look good. You like to look pretty. You were like that when you were 3 years old. That's your nature. So, it's just who you are. That's the way you were made. As you advance in Krishna consciousness, when you get older, you know what happens? That's less important. Look at Prabhupada disciples in their 60s and 70s, and you can see. Do they care so much about these things? Not so much anymore. And renunciation comes. And there are women who've never cared about these things. And men, you understand this is the nature of women. It doesn't mean they're not able to offer you good advice. If you're going to get married and think there's no good advice your wife can give you, don't get married, because it's just going to be horrible. And every intelligent man appreciates his wife for giving him good advice, for pointing out things that he doesn't see. And every intelligent man will understand that he grew in many ways by being married. So if we just look at it through this lens, no, women are less intelligent, I have nothing to learn from them, only I can instruct them, and whatever they say is of no value, that's unfortunate. But it is not entirely uncommon for men to think this way to some degree. And you may say, no, men don't think this way anymore in ISKCON. They do, but it's more subtle. How could they not think this way? Because they're hearing it. They heard it as brahmacharis. It's hard to come back to center when you've heard something off center for so long. That hasn't been explained to you. So, but I think the important point is that Prabhupada said when a woman becomes a devotee, she becomes the most intelligent. So even these intelligent women, they like 8 saris for every 1 dhoti their husband has, but still, they understand Krishna consciousness, they understand the purpose of life. And it's more like this material side, it's not a big thing. You know, like I have godbrothers who are connoisseurs, so they like nice things. So whenever they're buying something, they spend a lot of money and they buy the best. Does that mean they're not Krishna conscious? No, it just means they like nice things for their service and for their life, and they're not attached to material enjoyment, just as your wife is not necessarily being degraded by material enjoyment. Because they're devotees. So, you know, husband protecting wife spiritually, the best protection you can give your wife spiritually is just be a good example. Rise early, chant your rounds, be a good devotee, be sense-controlled. That's so powerful for a woman. A woman loves that. Because if you're more Krishna conscious, if you're more sense-controlled, if you're more regulated, you're more stable than she is, she'll appreciate that so much because you'll be filling in for anything she lacks. And then, as Prabhupada said, she'll naturally follow you. So, by your example, any so-called less intelligence that's left, you will help her overcome that. And she'll become strong and austere and so forth. I've also seen women do incredible austerities, as they do with raising children, but I've seen them do incredible austerities in Sankirtan, more so than the men, on parikrama, living in India and so on. So my warning to men is please don't generalize, and don't think that all women are like this, because many women know Shastra much better than you, many women are more renounced than you, many women understand Prabhupada's heart more than you, and you just, you know, slice your ego down a few levels because you just admit it. And if you can't admit it, then I would ask you to reflect on why you can't admit it, what's going on, because I think you're wearing convoluted glasses, right? And you might say, well, but I'm better than her in this way and that way. Okay, fine. You're better than a lot of people in this way and that way, but see the ways that she may be better than you. See the things that she understands, or the devotion she has that you don't have. Like my wife is very attached to deity worship. We have many deities and she worships them every day. She's much more attached than I am. So that's helpful for me. And she's much more, in certain ways, I don't know how to say this, but she's very pure. I think pure in ways that I'm not even pure. And so to not acknowledge that would be foolish, wouldn't it? Say, no, I'm better because I'm a man. So here's a conversation. This is and we read this. I think it's worth reading this again. Prabhupada's talking about a couple, Nandarani and Dayananda. Both of them are very intelligent, and Nandarani is more intelligent than her husband. I know that, Atreya Rishi. I find that he is very intelligent, Srila Prabhupada. Dayananda. Atreya Rishi. Yes, Prabhupada, he's intelligent, but Nandarani is still more intelligent. Prabhupada laughs. I know that. Both of them are intelligent, but this girl appears to be more intelligent. So So now, what kind of intelligence is Prabhupada referring to? Well, this is interesting, because Chanakya Pandit says that women are more cunning than men. And so what does cunning mean? Cunning means clever. So is clever a synonym to intelligent? I think it is. You can look it up, see if it's a synonym. And so now, so therefore, we have to consider, if Prabhupada's saying women are less intelligent, it's in the Bhagavatam, and now he's saying the wife is more intelligent, what does he mean? She's more Krishna conscious, she understands the philosophy better, she has more practical wisdom. It could mean any of those things. Is Prabhupada willing to admit it? Obviously, yes. Are some of our men in our movement willing to admit this? Obviously, no. Interesting, isn't it? And that's my whole point. We're one of the dangers that faces our movement is that we're not willing to look at things the way Prabhupada looked at it, both on the conservative and the liberal side. So sometimes Prabhupada may say something very liberal, and the conservatives, they write it off. They say, no, that's not what he meant, or he was just saying it, or he was just joking, he wasn't serious. See, it said he was laughing, which means he's not serious, he was playing with them. But he says it again, because Atreya Rishi is saying, no, but Dayananda is very intelligent. Prabhupada said, I know, but she's more intelligent. So something's going on there. He's seeing some quality in her, right? So we can't just write that off. That would be wrong. Now, Prabhupada says something very conservative, and then sometimes we'll say, I can't agree with that. No, don't say that. Say, I need to better understand this. Don't ever say I can't. When Prabhupada says it's like this, don't say I don't agree with it. That actually is offensive. Say, I need to understand this, or I need to discuss this with others to better understand what Prabhupada's saying, because this doesn't make sense to me. And I know it makes sense, but I don't know how it makes sense, because Prabhupada wouldn't say something that is not right, but I need to understand it. So that's the way we approach the conservative. And if Prabhupada says something which seems to a conservative mind very liberal or washed down and watered down, we can't try to make believe he didn't say it. We try to understand the context and understand that he's broad-minded, and he's not limiting himself to a certain way of thinking in every situation. He may, in some situations, obviously, this is a principle, it applies in every situation. Here's a principle, here's a point of philosophy that doesn't apply in this situation. So, you can err on either side, on the side of being liberal and the side of being conservative. Right? So if I'm too liberal, then I will doubt something that Prabhupada said that I think is wrong or ultra-conservative. Or if I'm too conservative, I will doubt something Prabhupada said that I think is wrong. It's liberal. It's not really what he meant. So, if Prabhupada says something and it's very clear what he says, and you say it's not what he meant, you better have a good way to explain that he didn't mean that, a good context. Otherwise, it's offensive, because you're coming from too much of a conservative view. And what Prabhupada just said doesn't support your conservative agenda. So we don't want to have agendas, we just want to understand Prabhupada. And when you have agendas, how will you understand? So, Prabhupada said this, but I don't agree with this. Like, what kind of statement is that? I don't agree with this. No, the reality is you don't understand it, so just say, I don't understand it. Don't say I don't agree with it, I just don't understand it. And I need to understand it. And please help me understand it, right? So now we're discussing this statement, women are less intelligent, which disturbs many women when they hear it, devotees and non-devotees. So if you understand what Prabhupada means, then you go, oh, okay, now I understand what he means. It's not the way I thought it was. So rather than saying, I don't agree with this, say, I don't understand it. And And then you'll understand that a lot of things you didn't agree with were not what Prabhupada meant by saying they're less intelligent. So you really did agree with Prabhupada, you just didn't know you did. Okay. Does that make sense? To understand, quote, the women are less intelligent, unquote, statement, we need to consider what intelligence means in this or other contexts. In Sanskrit, there are several words that are translated as intelligence. One is buddhi, which refers to the ability to analyze, judge, or discern. Discrimination, sometimes Prabhupada says intelligence means to discriminate between matter and spirit, or to discriminate between what is right and what is wrong. It makes sense. Thank you, Carla. 5 stars for Carla. She agrees with me. Once a devotee asked Prabhupada that Shastra says that all women should always serve their husband. Actually, what he said is the husband is always, Shastra says that the husband is like the dominant. Yeah, serve, dominant, he's always right. That's what he meant. And Prabhupada replied, you should be so arrogant to think like that. Like, I'm always right. Of course you're not always right. Like, okay, you're not married, and I ask you the question, have you always been right in everything you've said and done your whole life? Obviously you'll say no. Now you're married. All of a sudden, everything you do and say now from this point, from the wedding day forward, is always right in relation to your wife? Obviously not. So Prabhupada saying, you used to be so arrogant to think that you're always right and your wife should just do whatever you say, like you're perfect. Because that's the implication. My wife should do whatever I say. Okay, so you're perfect. Right? Well, maybe you are perfect. I don't know. I don't want to judge you. But that's something you have to determine. Even a guru, sometimes he'll give an instruction and the disciples will say, but in this context I don't think that would be a good idea. And he'll listen to it and he'll say, okay, what would you suggest? And the disciples say, I suggest we do this. He'll consider it and say, okay. So even the guru is not coming across as, I'm perfect. If something he says is not understood or questioned by a disciple, he'll listen. Okay, what's your doubt? Well, yes, in this context, maybe what you're saying has validity. I wasn't referring to that context, but your point is good. Or in this context, this principle is not applicable. Yes, that's a good point. I didn't mention that, but that is also true. So it's not that the guru thinks he's perfect. Only Krishna is perfect. We say guru is perfect when he is perfectly representing Shastra, guru, and sadhu, of course. That's a whole other topic. But obviously, from your wedding day on, doesn't all of a sudden empower you to become perfect. So, buddhi refers to the ability to analyze or discern or discriminate between matter and spirit. And generally, it's considered that men have a greater capacity for this kind of spiritual discernment. Spiritual, not dissertation, discernment. But men have a huge capacity for sense gratification, for degradation. And women have a huge capacity, not capacity, but women have a more openness to religiosity. So, great, men, you can use your brain well to discern matter and spirit and become these amazing philosophers, speculators, jnanis, munis, and never surrender to Krishna, while your wives are going to the temple doing kirtan. As we have examples of the wives of the Brahmins. It's similar. So, men will read this and say, oh yeah, this kind of intelligence is this male intelligence that makes us superior. But this male intelligence may also entangle you in endless speculation and unwillingness to surrender. Right? So, men, you have to be humble because the problem is, because of the male ego or just ego in general, when anything is said to enforce our position as being better than another group, we tend to run with it and say, yeah, I'm a man, or I'm a white male, or I'm a disciple of so-and-so. That makes me better. So that's the disease. That's the material disease. We want to be better, right? So that's the problem, and you need to be aware of this, that the ego is always looking for something to say, look at me, I'm better. So then you read Shastra and you find something. Oh, men are more intelligent. See, I'm better than... I walk into the temple, I look at the women and think, oh, you're just stupid women. Maybe in your next life, you'll become a man and you'll become intelligent like me. And, I'm not going to go to your classes because what do I have to hear from you? And I'm not going to listen to my wife because what can she tell me? She's just a woman. So, am I exaggerating? A little bit, not entirely. But the principle is that anytime we get some recognition as being better, there's a tendency to use that against other people who are, according to the statement that made us better, not as good as we are. Does that make sense? Because I see this all the time. This is the nature of conditioned life. If you get a superior position, you'll tend to misuse it. That's why it is said power corrupts. And we see that you give someone a little power, they tend to misuse it to dominate others, because that tendency to dominate is so strong. Thank you. Jai Radhika, you also get 5 stars because you agree with me. Whoever agrees with me gets 5 stars. Actually, it's not agreeing with me, it's agreeing with Shastra. So this is a sociological, psychological reality. You give someone power, it tends to alter their consciousness in a way that they become a little dominant. We see it in ourselves, we see it in others, right? So the men are thinking, yes, I'm more intelligent. And so Shastra says man has this ability to discriminate. He's more intelligent. And then if reading that causes you to become proud, then how intelligent are you? Pretty stupid, actually, if you think about it. So that statement caused you to become proud. That's really stupid, isn't it? So now we have to retract the statement that you're more intelligent, because the statement that said you're more intelligent just made you more stupid. Interesting, isn't it? Okay. Another Sanskrit word for intelligence is medha. In the 10th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna lists medha among 7 feminine qualities. Medha means mental vigor, wisdom, prudence. From Prabhupada's purport to Bhagavad Gita 10:34, quote, the ability not only to read many books on different subject matters, but to understand them and apply them when necessary is intelligence, medha, another opulence. And you find nowadays there are more women graduating university than men, and women have certain skills that men don't have. And we just went to a workshop, I was telling you yesterday, my wife and I, and we had some guests over yesterday, and my wife was explaining what we had learned. And she was explaining it much better than I could explain it. She's really good when she's interested in something and she goes to class. She's like, she can explain it all perfectly. So, are women better students than boys? The statistics I read in America, yes. Okay, so a different kind of intelligence. So, when Prabhupada says, or Shastra says they're less intelligent, does that mean they're not so good in school? No. They generally do better than boys. So what does it mean? So you have to understand, here's another example of intelligence, that they have this kind of intelligence, which is described as mental vigor, wisdom, prudence, and which is elaborated on, read many books, they can read many books, but they can understand and apply them when necessary. Thus, these are broad classifications: buddhi, analytical intelligence; medha, nourishing, practical intelligence. So, she's just making this point that if you're going to say women are less intelligent, you have to define intelligence, and you have to know the context. So this is from Bhagavatam 1.8.20. The Lord is so kind that he does not show special favor only to one who is a great philosopher. He knows the sincerity of purpose. For this reason only, women generally assemble in great numbers in any sort of religious function. In every country and in every sect of religion, it appears that the women are more interested than the men. So, it's been a, I don't know, you could call it an urban legend or an idea that we've always understood that it's more difficult for women to be devotees because they're more materially attached. That's what's been taught, right? But here, Prabhupada is kind of turning that idea upside down. As I said, often that male intelligence becomes a way that they kind of explain themselves out of having to surrender. Or they end up becoming Mayavadis, or not accepting Krishna conscious philosophy. They speculate their way out of it. And so Prabhupada's making the point here that women, by nature, are more inclined to attend religious ceremonies. We also see something that's very important. In this idea that the male position is better because they're more sense-controlled. Well, that's true, but it's also true that men have bigger egos than women, and it's harder for men to be in the serving mode, which is why sometimes men have difficulty in marriage being subordinate sometimes to the will of their wife, like, could you clean your room, could you wash the dishes? No, I'm the man, don't tell me what to do. The women by nature, they like to serve. It's just how Krishna created them. So their egos are less and their serving nature is more. Male ego is more. And so what's very interesting is that the Gurukula, I've made this point before and it's kind of funny. In a sense, you could say the Gurukula is training the boys to be like women because the boys learn service to the Guru right from the beginning. And they cook, they wash their own clothes, they clean their rooms, they serve the Guru, they serve the senior devotees, their teachers, and so on. So they're chiseling away at their false ego. They're learning to become more servants, which is a female nature. So you could joke and say, well, what do you learn at the Gurukul? You learn how to become women, more women-like because of that. The nature of women to serve, and the male ego, that I'm right, you do this, you do what I say. So men have some advantages and disadvantages, and women have some advantages and disadvantages. But our movement has tended to focus on disadvantages of women, not disadvantages of men, isn't it? Or more focused on advantages of men. And here it's right in black and white that women tend to be more religious than men. Prabhupada elsewhere says they're simpler, so they don't speculate as the Krishna says this. Yes, okay, I accept it. So let's just read a little more before we end. However, both men and women have both the buddhi and metta types of intelligence. It's a matter of the degrees of each. We need to avoid jumping to conclusions about a person or a group of people based on what body they are wearing around their intelligence. So yeah, you may have a certain kind of intelligence, your husband has a certain kind of intelligence, your wife has a certain kind of intelligence. I think the real problem is to deny that intelligence is functioning the way it's functioning, based on the body. Oh, he's intelligent. Maybe he's not intelligent. Maybe she's more intelligent, but we think he's more intelligent because he's a man. We think she's less intelligent because she's a woman, but in reality, it's not what's happening. So all I'm saying is, when you look at generalizations, at the same time, look at what you're looking at, what's in front of you. If what's in front of you doesn't conform to these generalizations, don't see it through convoluted glasses that force you to believe that it is this way. Oh, all men are this way, all women are this way, but this man is not that way, and this woman is not that way, and I'm seeing they're not that way. So just see it, acknowledge it, admit it, and don't deal with them as if they're not the way you're seeing they are, or don't deny. I think the other problem is you deny what you're seeing. Not deny what you're seeing. You don't see what you're seeing because you're trying to see it through what you read about men or women, so you see it that way. Does that make sense? It's like what we're seeing this in America is this amazing phenomena. That there's some people that love Trump so much that no matter what he says or does, they don't see it as bad. Because they have this conception in their idea that Trump is like the savior of America. He's the best thing that ever happened to America. So, it doesn't matter what he does. They see it through that lens. And other people are not seeing it through a lens of Trump is good or bad. They're just seeing what he does. And they're trying to communicate with the Trump people who think everything he does is wonderful. And they have these conversations that are totally irrational, dysfunctional, disconnected, nonsensical. Because these people are unwilling to admit what they see. Because they're seeing through a certain lens. So we can easily do that with Shastra. We don't see what we're seeing. We say, well, the Shastra says this, or this is what I think the Shastra says, and then we see it that way, but we're not actually seeing what's happening. So, I will end here. And we have to remember that we're on page 10. Somebody, can you remember for next week that we're on page 10? And we'll continue. Does anyone have any questions? It doesn't seem like there are any questions I haven't answered. Your comments were just agreeing. And I was reading your comments as we're going. Yeah, this is, of course, we're talking about men and women. So this is, I think obviously we're understanding it's something that we all perhaps don't completely understand, and it can create problems because we don't understand. But there are many things in Krishna consciousness that are like this. That if we don't understand the context and the everything that Prabhupada has said about it, and we can misunderstand, and it creates problems. And it creates, blindness, fanaticism, and so forth. Okay, so we'll see you next Saturday at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Some of you came on at 9 o'clock Eastern Standard. You missed the first hour. But these classes go up, obviously, on my Facebook page, and they go up on YouTube. So you can see them there if you like, and share them. I think it's important to share these classes with at least 100,000 devotees. So if all you share it, all of you listening share with 100,000 devotees, then I think every devotee will hear the class, and I think it will be helpful. Thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Go.